Greetings, everybody, from wherever and whenever you are watching this or listening to us. This is the Megrow podcast, episode 47. I am Reto Bosi, the host of today's episode, and I'm also the managing director of Megrow Consulting, based in Switzerland. I'm very happy. I'm delighted to have a guest with me today, Paul Kaye. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning, Reto. How are you?
Good morning to you. In London, very well. Yourself? Ready for today?
Very good, thank you. Yeah, enjoying the hot weather.
Good. Same here.
This gets forecast, but it's beautiful.
Exactly. We have two types of heat, right? The internally created and the externally created heat. Okay, let me briefly introduce a bit the topic, the subject, and then we'll get into conversation. Paul is a mathematics graduate. He's also a chartered insurance broker and a qualified mathematics teacher. He has an extensive career in the risk transfer insurance industry with leading players such as Commercial Union, which is now Aviva, Benfield, Greg, Aon, where he was the head of international actuarial and enterprise risk management for a number of years. Since 2018, that's about 6 years now, he's in a part-time role with Aon, focusing on aviation reinsurance analytics. And a bit more specifically to the conversation today, we were actually introduced to each other by a mutual friend. When I do work with our clients about risk management, I observe that sometimes we tend to fall into this trap to spend too much time discussing and deciding on certain things, right? We all have a good view how much this pen costs. Hence, it's natural that we spend time on this. Everybody is an expert. Everybody has a view on that. But in today's and tomorrow's VUCA world, where things are more uncertain, more complex, more ambiguous, we need to shift our focus. We need to learn how to deal with managing uncertainty. And this is sort of the link to Paul. And that's why I got so interested and so super excited in this topic, because Paul is a and the lead author of several publications that deal with risk measurement, published by Casualty Actuarial Society and other papers. We'll get to that. So he and his colleagues have developed a method. He calls it 6 principles to support improved decision making. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So Paul, sorry for the lengthy introduction, but I thought it's important that we're all clear on this. Go ahead.
Okay, well, we'll come back to the background of the group and things in a moment, but I thought it'd be useful to start you off with a sort of a little conundrum. Now, I guess there's people in a sort of wide variety of sectors and areas here, but this is a typical insurance or actuarial problem here, that you've got 10 loss amounts and someone says, well, what's happening at the extreme? What's the 1 in 100 event? So when we use the word sort of loss exceedance there, imagine you've got 100 of these losses all listed in a row. How big might you expect the largest one to be? But you've got 1,000 losses. How big would the largest 10 exceed by? So we've got these 10 losses. Now, if you add those 10 together and divide by 10, you'll find the answer is 100. So one scenario, an actuary might look at that list, and in our sort of green scenario, they might say, well, this behaves very much like an exponential distribution with a mean of 100. And then you can put it into Excel or whatever software you've got, and you can establish very precisely that the 1 in 100 number will be 461. Okay. However, we have these 10 losses and their mean is 100. But you know, that's a bit random. The true underlying mean might not be 100. So maybe we'll go with the exponential distribution, but we're not sure what that mean is. And we could get very clever about it and put a distribution around the 100 number and sort of do some simulation. And if you did something like that and looked at the 1 in 100 number, you would probably find it's something bigger than 461. Right. True mean may be higher or lower than 100.
So again, going back to what I said earlier on, right? If we see these numbers as laypersons, we would say, okay, fine, somewhere between 25 and 300. So we see these numbers, right? So we have maybe even track record. Those might even be numbers that our organization has experience with. So we tend to be geared towards saying, okay, if in the past it was like this, future also might be like that. But that's obviously not the case, right?
And that's so the context for us would be if you're in reinsurance, you're often trying to protect against really remote events, but often you only got 5-10 years worth of actual history. The whole reinsurance industry regulation runs off capital models where you're expected to hold capital at the 1 in 200 level. So you're often asked to estimate things at the tail where you've only got sort of evidence in the more near term. But that is the problem you're faced with. Right. So I bring us to our end.
And that goes for any type of decisions, right? Regardless of whether we're a big insurance company dealing with potentially large losses or whether we're a smaller enterprise that looks something outside of the normal or the known. Yep.
Absolutely. And everyone has to worry about the extreme, what could go wrong. And people like to put measurements on it, be it 1 in 100, 1 in 200, or if you're in the nuclear industry, 1 in 10,000, or whatever it is, they protect nuclear plants too. So our red scenario then is, well, actually, I'm not going to give you any more information at all. You've just got these 10 losses. You don't know what the true underlying mean is. You don't actually know what mathematical distribution. There probably won't be a mathematical description of what the distribution is. It's an unknown situation. And what's the 1 in 100 number? And then the truth is, you just don't really know. Now, the real point of this as a starter is to say, in the real world, it's always red. And 99 point something percent of the time in the insurance industry, everybody pretends it's green. Because if they don't pretend it's green, they don't know what to do. They can't move forward. So there's sort of a bit of a myth goes on, but it's a known myth. Everyone knows they're doing it, but it's so they can practically continue and work on.
If I can just make another link to what I'm seeing sometimes in practice is, and that's often a challenge for us as risk practitioners, right? We have a professional mandate to cover green, amber, and red, but let's say if sometimes if we talk to business owners or very senior people, they don't want to hear the red 15,000 times a day, right? So we need to be sure that when we position ourselves or when we communicate that we always look at the entire range. But that's important not to forget the red, right?
Well, I think the other key thing is if you keep telling everyone it's red, they get really annoyed with you because they agree it's red, but you're not helping them do anything with it. And I think that's probably where we came from with this group. Now, this example, the group I was involved with, which I'll talk about in a moment, there's quite a lot of people, a lot of very experienced senior people in the reinsurance industry. And this example is not my example. And I must make that point for a lot of what I'm going to show you. There's lots of bits of it from me, but it was very much a team effort and our thinking evolved. So, sorry, we've got a point at the end there about, so there's a point at the very bottom there. Can this be quantified? And I'm actually not an actuary, but I work in very much actuarial role amongst actuaries. And as a cohort of actuaries who really just try and quantify everything. If you tell them don't quantify it, they're a bit of a loss. And I guess that's where this sort of group came from. So it started in, I think, a conversation in about 2012 at one of the general insurance actuarial conventions in the UK. And I was talking to someone, they had a group going, which was all about 1 in 200. Everyone was worried about 1 in 200 because of the capital regulations. And everyone knew that was a flawed issue. But what was interesting, this group, it was obviously sponsored by the Institute of Faculty of Actuaries. Probably half the group weren't actuaries, but I think that was quite healthy. People worked in a variety of sectors, quite senior positions. So these are sort of partners of consulting firms. The chief actuary at Lloyd's of London was part of the group. As a lawyer, we had a variety of skills. And one of the driving concerns of the actuaries was actually they felt that professionally they were being compromised because they were being asked to quote 1 in 200 numbers from their models. People were taking those very, very literally. And it almost wasn't in the interest of the actuary to sort of challenge the fact that they were being taken so literally. The Actuarial Institute itself probably wasn't highlighting this issue enough. So the idea was then to look at uncertainty. We dropped the with professionals a bit at one point. It's got an insurance context. It came from insurance, but actually it's all about everything. It's about living. It's any decision you might make.
Right.
We've got case studies about buying a house in the paper, and
Yep.
yeah.
Can I just pick up on that point?
Yep.
I mean, what happens sometimes, you go to conferences, you have great conversations with people, and then you sort of leave the conference and nothing happens, right? Even if we agree with each other that method A or method B is not the best thing. So what was sort of the trigger point this time that you didn't all go home after the conference, but said, okay, let's now really do something about it?
I think it bothered a lot of people, but the other bit, it's very easy to sort of do a review of uncertainty and just come up with a paper of all these cataclysmic historic decisions where everyone got it massively wrong. And it's fascinating, but we didn't think that was actually useful. So a big driver was, how can we do something? I didn't want a paper that sort of left it there on a sort of dusty shelf and no one would ever referred to. We've been through a pandemic and no one's ever referred to this, but part of my reason for being here is to say, look, this is actually quite practical and useful. And I think we think it does work. When you think about situations, we've got 6 principles here. You don't use all 6 in all occasions, but when you're stuck and you don't know what to do, dipping into these 6 and thinking, how can they give you a more structured way forward is proactive.
Right.
We also wanted sort of the elevator pitch. If you had a CEO and you got 30 seconds, how could you grab their attention? And that's where the 6 principles come from. There is a feast of things beneath each of these, which probably further research could be done.
Right.
But the idea is to grab people to start with.
I mean, one of the reasons, naturally, I do spend time reading what learned scholars publish and write about it. But one thing that really stuck with me when I went through your paper, I like its structure. It's at principle level, so it's sophisticated, but it's not excessively complex in the beginning, right? So that as a risk, I mean, I'm a scientist, but not a mathematician. So that not the non-mathematical people are not lost straight away, right? I like
no
its
math in
structure.
this paper.
Exactly.
I apologize for the reference to exponential distribution on the early slide.
No.
That probably is the only mathematical mention in the paper. It is a non-math paper. This is
I mean, it is always that challenge that I referred to earlier on, right? You want, or we want to be professional and have certain methods and principles, but depending on what audience you have, if we throw in too much lingo right at the beginning, the audience switches off and moves somewhere else, right? Yeah.
It's also partly how the paper was written. You've got these 6 things to remember, which hopefully after this session, you'll hopefully remember them a bit. If you look at the paper, each principle has an executive summary of a paragraph or 2. So you could read all 6 principles probably in 2 or 3 minutes. And then the whole paper before the actual principle part's only about 30 pages. But you can go into the case studies if you wish.
Yeah, and then the reference material, the details, the contact details, the paper, we'll all put it somewhere here or there or wherever in the show notes afterwards, so that if any one of you listening or watching this are interested in follow-up, please do so. Okay, maybe Paul, you just take us through it. Thank you.
Take us through, and and we're to ask questions as we go here. So the first big principle and big issue is that most people tend to ignore uncertainty for the reasons we've already discussed. It's just really, really hard. So principle number 1 is face up to uncertainty. Don't simply ignore it, okay? We'll go through the rest in a moment. And I think there's obviously a lot more in the paper about this, but I think a lot of situations, imagine you went to a casino and you were playing blackjack. You've got all the information about the probabilities, assuming there's no sort of dodgy stuff going on, and you can model that completely and try and work out exactly what you're doing. In that case, all of the problem is effectively quantifiable. You know the probabilities, and it's a modeling challenge. And then the further you move away from that, even just having lots of statistics, even if you've got a lot of statistics, you don't actually know the true probabilities. Statistics give you clues of what the probabilities are, but only clues. But even so, I used to do sort of motor insurance pricing where we had 1 million records of cars, etc. Very much a modeling challenge, lots of quantification. But an awful lot of situations you find them are actually on the right-hand side, where the amount that's actually quantifiable is actually quite small. And we naturally are reporting for this. We all home in on that, and because that's what we can do. But we tend to ignore the rest. So this whole paper is about what do you do when you're in that right-hand side. Um, the big point about the paper is there's some biological issues here. The brain, the way we operate as human beings, is to keep recognizing patterns, trying to predict things. We walk down the street, we're constantly predicting things. So we can fundamentally bias towards having a good guess of what might happen next. And so by facing to uncertainty, you're almost going against that natural tendency. So you do have to step back and think.
Right. I mean, I'm often related to that, trying to preach, so to speak, risk culture. And risk culture starts at the top. So there needs to be consideration for what's on the right. The uncertainty challenge needs to be embraced. It can certainly not be swept under the carpet or delegated down to a summer intern, right? So that's why I like this point so much, that we have those two components.
But it's a great idea saying face up to uncertainty, but having faced up to it, what on earth do you do? And I think that the sort of next 4 principles of the 6 give you the sort of tools you can actually draw upon. So if we're happy to go along. And the first one is to just deconstruct the problem. Now, we've got, just generally speaking, breaking, if you've got a very messy, complex situation, as is often the case in the real world, breaking to parts is generally good. The one warning is that you can break it into such small parts, you end up forgetting what the whole's all about, and do some have really interesting insights, but sort of, can't see the wood for the trees. There's many ways you can deconstruct. We talk in the paper about the actual decision-making process. How do you actually frame a question, ask a question? What sort of work is actually done as part of that? And then how's that then communicated? How's the decision actually made at the end? You've got a whole set of stakeholders in a decision. Who's actually making decisions? Who are the influences? What part do they play? Breaking that helps. A particularly interesting one I found was the lawyer person I mentioned in the group had fascinating insights into assumptions and we've got this idea when we have a problem, when you're talking about a difficult problem around a group, around a board table, often there's lots of assumptions which are sort of clearly out there, very explicit assumptions everyone gets. But there's often a huge number of really crucial, fundamental assumptions which no one talks about. They're implicit in the situation. And quite often you find that there isn't actually agreement on those implicit assumptions.
And then there is, go ahead. Yeah, there's
an uncertainty onion analogy we have in the paper with the sort of layers of the onion, where we talk about the fact that, there's some problems are so complex, but not everybody can get to the inner part of the onion. But at the outer part, people do need to understand what's going on with the problem. And some bits of the onion are in the ground and sort of the roots are sort of buried and people can't see these assumptions, and some bits are above. So it's just a sort of idea to help people think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I find this extremely helpful, again, that stepwise approach. And when we go about such type of work, again, it's very easy to get lost in the jungle of uncertainties and big risks and emerging risks and so on and so forth. As a guiding principle, what I always find helpful is to see whether the problem is actually related to your strategy and to your KPIs, to bring it a bit further down, because it's very tempting to talk about black swans, right? Spend endless, but we'll never be able to get our hands on truly understanding a black swan. And probably by the time we've understood it, the bus has left the station already, right? Or the swan has appeared. So it's really a key point to not stay away from this linking it to KPIs and then deconstructing it.
Yeah, and that deconstruct, the other thing here, we're talking about, face up to uncertainty, but actually uncertainty itself, there are many different types. Now you might have heard 3 or 4 types, etc. We scanned around here. I think there's a chap called Professor Simon French, and he there's a group. Oh, I forget their full name. It's cited in the paper properly, but they basically look into uncertainty. It's a sort of global group, and that they have 25 of them. But I distilled these down to about, I think it's just under 10, which I got his approval for my attempt to do it. We were liaising with them, but there's actual the stochastic uncertainty, limited knowledge, you get fortuitous outcomes effectively. You've got limited, not epistemic uncertainty, where you've got limited knowledge because you just don't understand how the system works. If I said I'm rolling a die, you might assume it's 6-sided, but you don't know whether it's a 4-sided or a 12-sided die. You've got the fact that the model itself might have limitations, general ambiguity issues, you've got operational errors go on.
That was just a beautiful example to the implicit assumptions, right? I assume it's a standard die with 6 sides, right? But without clarifying it up front, you might have another model, right?
And there's another couple of sort of social ones about individual people behavior and their personalities and attitudes. That creates sort of a sort of chaotic feature sometimes to how you're going to go forward with a problem, but also more social group think type behaviors, which again can be quite uncertain and can influence the best way forward. So anyway, deconstructing generally is a good thing. Just step back when you've done that to sort of think, does it all the bits stack up?
It may be helpful to have a good facilitator in the group or in the team during that throughout all the 6 steps, right?
Yeah, Beretta, you make a really, really interesting point here. This was all about decision making, this paper. So whilst most people in the group were probably advisors to people making decisions, this is focused at the decision maker. And you do need the decision maker to be engaged with this, because the advisor can only go so far. So the extent to which you need a facilitator probably partly depends on how contentious the decision is. If everyone's on the same page with which brings us on to the next one a bit about don't be fooled, unintentional biases. If there are intentional biases, some arbitration is actually very, very valuable. And the thing about biases is the more uncertain it is, basically biases are far more influential, far more powerful, partly because there's less fact, there's less certainty to sort of counter people's prejudice. That prejudice could be, sinister, manipulative, trying to sort of get their side over, or it could be very, very, as you put at the top there, unintentional, sort of unconscious biases.
That's a very powerful statement. That's a very powerful statement here. Yep.
So whenever you see uncertainty, just worry about who's in it, who's gaining what might go wrong. So, and I think, just going back a step. So in the paper, we talk a little bit about, and again, there's somebody particularly who's involved in this situation. So I think there's an example in the paper. One of an actuary often gets asked to set reserves for an insurance company. I've never done reserving, so I'm relieved of that problem. But of course, quite often, the person who wants the reserve setting has an agenda. They don't want them too big. It might affect their bonus. It might affect the ability to continue to pay dividends, etc. There's a complete conflict there. And the traditional sort of actuarial advice, I suppose, is just to be really open and transparent. But actually, if you're in a sort of negotiation, uncertain situation with someone with lots of bias, where they know all the information about what they want out of the negotiation, if all you're going to do is just sort of roll over and sort of show your hand, that's a really bad way of playing the game. So the sort of paper talks about this. Should an actuary be a bit more happy? And
or reality sits here, and you are sort of operating somewhere over here, right? With a disconnect, yeah.
So there's almost an element of what is professionalism here. Some would say professionalism is to just say be completely transparent, but if you do that, actually you might end up with an outcome which is skewed towards the person who asked the question, and the answer is heavily influenced by that intentional bias.
What's it called? The hippo, right? The highest paid individual present, or something like that, right?
Yeah, all sorts of exactly. No, indeed. The unintentional biases are quite interesting. Now, there's all sorts of some literature on psychological biases. One thing we did that was a bit more original is to actually take these and actually put them into these three. We deconstructed them, in fact. We deconstructed them into these categories of what we call latent framing, traps, and overinterpretation. There is a list of all these in the paper, so I'm not going to be able to go and cite. But latent framing, a key question is how the question is asked. Often you get questions asked unintentionally in a very biased way, almost seeking confirmation. Confirmation bias being a well-known psychological trap. Or you could have after the big earthquake, how likely is the earthquake to occur, which just happened last week? Well, it's encouraging an answer which is probably far more frequent than, maybe more, an event which hasn't happened for a million years, for example. So there's a whole host of things.
Is everybody in agreement with me that this is right?
Yeah, but the danger of the groupthink is maybe everyone thinks the question was impartial. So sometimes you've got to step back and say, is it really, really okay? So the whole stuff there. Traps, you get just all sorts of traps when you actually start to analyze things. The winner's curse, gambler's fallacy. I'm not going to go into all the detail of those, but there are things which you can just get caught out by. And then finally, you get your results, and there's this tendency to over or under interpret data. Back to the, I just had a big loss yesterday. You tend to, or just people spot patterns. They like to spot patterns even when they're not there. It's one of the ways I think they sort of check for coding stuff, don't they? Look for randomness, and they find some of these sort of hacking type cyber things. They find things or fraud detection. They find things are too random, and they find that they're so evenly spread it can't have been done randomly. But it's this idea that we're not very good at that, and therefore we have to be really careful about reading something into some data which really isn't there. Back to that 1 in 100 earlier on.
Now, you see, if I can just pick up on all this, if I put myself into the shoes of a senior risk person, let's call him or her a CRO, right? There's the expectation that we have some subject matter expertise, that we know something about the industry or the activity that the organization is involved in. And then thirdly, we should either ourselves or have somebody with us who is capable and able to detect and absorb and manage all these things we've just been talking about, right? That's personally, I enjoy that challenge, but it can be plain scary at the same time.
But it's interesting. How do you manage these things then? I mean, these biases are all over the place. Sometimes they will be important and matter to a decision and corrupt it, and other times they'll just be there and not that consequential. But the main way you manage them, I think, is to shine a light on them. Okay, so moving on to our next principle. Models can be helpful, but also dangerous. And again, we've got a group of actuaries here, we love our models, etc. And I think, they really, really can be helpful. It's even in situations which are not that modelable, models often have a useful role, but you do have to understand the limitations before you use them blindly. I went to a presentation back in, I'm guessing the date, 2016, something like that, by a gentleman by the name of Gerd Gigerenzer. I don't know if any people of the audience have heard of Gerd. He's a German. I think he's now in his mid-70s. He's a professor of psychology, does quite a lot in, I think he's one of the director of the Max Planck Institute in Germany, visiting professor in the US somewhere. But done a lot of work with health and the use of data and all the rest of it. Now, he talks a lot about the use of heuristics, complicated word, but rules of thumb. And his point is, if you actually have a lot of data on the right-hand side, back to my either you've got loads of data. I mentioned I used to do sort of motor pricing many years ago. But if you've got lots of data, or the probabilities, like in a casino, then make your models really, really complex. Model to death, brilliant. However, when you've got situations of very high uncertainty, you make it simple. And as we saw earlier with my sort of, red, amber, green situation, most of the time it is a bit red. And therefore, most of the time, you need to be quite careful about going down the sort of route of complicated models and making it simple. Now, the idea of heuristics is interesting. When we talk about this, so heuristics might be, I'm trying to think of a good example, but they're often very simple things. If you have a good heuristic, I used to never trust somebody wearing a hat would be a heuristic. Okay. Now, what you tend to find
prejudice.
yeah, but what you tend to find is if you put a heuristic in the hands of somebody very green and naive, it often doesn't work. The best heuristics work because the person is quite wise and experienced in what we're talking about, and they know when to use them or not to use them. There was an excellent example. So Andy Haldane, I'm not sure if all the viewership would know of Andy Haldane. He was the chief economist of the Bank of England, and he left it recently. But he did some work with Gerd, the whole group of them at the Bank of England in about 2012 or leading up to 2012. And he did quite a famous paper called The Dog and the Frisbee. And then the sort of argument here is when a dog catches a frisbee, it's a really complicated thing, but I can be really sure about it. The dog doesn't model it. And what happens if there's a big gust of wind right at the very end, the dog will miss the frisbee, they'll mess up. But they do a really clever process. So the dog is operating with a whole set of heuristics to actually do what is a really, really complicated task. And this work that Andy Haldane and this Bank of England group did with Gerd involved was looking at banking regulation on a more simplified basis. So banks use ridiculously complicated models to produce 1 in 200 things, which are probably very, very clever and complicated, fairly impenetrable is my guess. I've not been involved with them, but I can imagine. And they were looking at sort of simple heuristics they might use. One I recall was thou shalt not have a leverage ratio bigger than X. And you're thinking, that sounds to me like quite a good rule of thumb. But, just don't have an over-leveraged bank or beyond a certain level is not a bad way. And I think they came with about 6 of these things. So it's a very worthwhile paper. It's quoted in the...
very tangible risk appetite statement, right? Very tangible.
Yeah, no, and maybe that's... But, again, there's a few nuances. You have to be careful about when it's appropriate to use these. I think you find sometimes in the real world, people use some very strong heuristics and then they get used in entirely the wrong situation. And then, some quite bad policy goes on because someone's tried to simplify a complicated problem and they come at some quite simple rules, which are really good as a starting point, but then without some intelligent thought are have horrible unintended
consequences. It's a good point, right? If that statement comes, liquidity not more or not less than X, it might also be interpreted, well, if the top-down message is already kind of conservative, then let me be even more conservative, right? And then on the flip side, that organization leaves opportunities on the table.
Another amusing one from Gerd's talk I remember was his comments about the use of the word optimization. And I made a point earlier, if you've got a few statistics, you don't actually know the underlying probabilities. You just have some strong clues as to what they might be. So his view is you're always operating in a world of uncertainty. And his argument is the term optimization is only relevant when you actually know the probabilities. And he gets frustrated because he was saying in the health sector, lots of people put forward grant proposals where they're going to optimize all sorts of different things. And they get all the money. The proposal which says, well, actually, you can't optimize this. We're going to try and do something better than we currently do. That's probably seems a weak proposal and doesn't get the money. So anyway, it's an interesting point. Optimization.
Possibility that this just results in curing symptoms, right? Versus addressing the underlying issue. Yeah.
Well, often you're making it. This is all about decision making, and the idea is, can we make a better decision to do something better than we would otherwise do? It might not be the best thing, but it's better than doing what we were doing. And I think, you are looking for the biggest leap forward, but nevertheless, assuming, just do something, just do better than we're currently doing is not a bad little mantra. So, an important principle. So we've had the run through these now. We've had the deconstruct get them here. We've had the deconstruct the problem, the don't be fooled. The models can be helpful, but we're still left with, what if none of these really work? And we're left with a sort of key principle, number 5. think about adaptability and resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea here is if it doesn't work out as you'd hoped, what situation are you left in? And the problem with the word resilience is it's quite negative. It's saying, how will you cope with disaster? So this used to be, the principle used to be called think about resilience. But with the adaptability bit, it's trying to sort of be a bit more positive. Someone used the word optionality, which I'm not sure is a real word, but it's the idea you've got choices, you can change your mind. There was, again, I'm going to give you a UK example here. This came from an actuarial conference where this issue was raised. So in the UK, several years ago now, there was a big thing about expanding extra runway capacity in the southeast of England. And there was, should we expand Heathrow or Gatwick? And Heathrow, and there were these papers done which were forecasting, air traffic, etc., out 50 years, trying to justify these multi-billion-pound investments. And this economist, Professor Paul Kaye, who was the speaker, and he was asked this question, and he says, well, it's clearly ridiculous because the Heathrow option involves tunneling under 25, it's billions and billions, and it's all based on sort of guessing what it's going to be like in 50 years. And he said quite clearly it ought to be Gatwick, which was quite a controversial point. But his reasons for saying it was, if you get it wrong, you can change your mind 10 years down the line with the Gatwick option. Whereas
the other one, you don't have a plan.
You're totally committed. There's only one way to go. So it was, and I think they did actually back Heathrow, but it still hasn't happened post the pandemic. But
all right,
interesting example. But yeah, no, and a lot of this is thinking through. So I should have said with the model example, the previous one, a lot of it's thinking through scenarios. If you can't model probabilities, use scenarios. They are, they basically they do two things. They help stimulate thinking about the system you're operating in. So you might be able to parameterize everything about your model, but can you understand the dynamics? If I, press this button here, something else will happen down there. At least getting that communication and understanding of what's going on. But then it also can help. You might not understand the probability of something, but I can see for it to be as bad as this, then this and this and this would need to happen. It helps thinking.
I'm personally a great fan of, I know it's not quite as mathematical and sophisticated, but I like sensitivity matrices a lot. Just giving you on simple 2 dimensions. If I'm wrong by X, 2X, 3X, 5X, that's possibly the consequences, right? Then at least
the only thing I would say about that can be an output. Thinking about what could actually cause you to do that is quite interesting. What sort of, because it's that reverse engineering of what might go wrong to make that happen. Even if you don't come to a conclusion, it sort of helps you rank likelihoods in a more structured way.
And the second point is, of course, the moment I put in numbers, that kind of implies an accuracy again, which I might not have, right?
It also hints of laziness because of this bias towards measurement. But if you think about S&P ratings, sort of, very strong. Sometimes that's all you're trying to do. You're trying to say that this is more credit worthy than that. You're not trying to say I know the probability. People will take credit ratings and translate it to probabilities.
Yeah. But sometimes a relative positioning is all you're looking for. Yeah. Agree.
It gives information, and you do that with numbers sometimes, but sometimes then people take those numbers too far. So anyway, it leads us on to our final principle. Bring people with you. And the consensus across our entire group is, of these 6 principles, 2 of them are far more important than the rest. The first one is the first one. You must face up to uncertainty in the first place, otherwise there's no point in looking at the rest of the principles. But this bring people with you is absolutely critical. However clever, and again, we talked about this advisor versus the decision maker. This is focused on the decision maker. The decision making is often using advisors, but often you've got an audience, people who have the consequences of the decision. Do you get buy-in? Are they happy with what you've done? And therefore, how you can bring people with you is key. And there's a
can we just go back to that slide just quickly, if you don't mind? Probably in other words, point 1 and 6 are a bit more consultant speak, the change management challenge, right? Getting
Okay.
stakeholders on board with you, whichever terminology you want to use, but that is so important. And then once that is done, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are then the methodology, the steps you go
That's
through. But
fair.
that's so crucial. Agree?
That's fair. But in terms of methodology to bring people with you, we've got a slightly frivolous cartoon here. This happens a lot in my career in insurance, where, and insurance is a very interesting industry. When I joined it, there was very few graduates in insurance. There was actuaries doing their stuff. I joined as a sort of management trainee, and with amongst lots of non-graduates who knew far more than I did. Some of the most sort of influential people in insurance have got very few qualifications. But you often find yourself in situations where you've got somebody who hasn't got number confidence, but actually really understands what's going on. And you've got someone with huge intellect and numbers, etc., who thinks they know what's going on, but actually is a bit marginalized because, in fact, they don't really get the real world. So there is this, and we've got the two words there, trust and communication.
Yeah.
Now, trust is a tricky one because trust takes time. So if you're looking at a situation about what to do in some crisis moment, if there's no prior relationship or rapport between the decision maker, the advisor, it's like when Warren Buffett says he wants to do something or something's gone wrong, everybody trusts him because he's done it for years and he's communicated well, etc. But if someone randomly says, I'm going to do this radical thing, or this went wrong, and I'm sorry, well, most people will get fired. Warren Buffett won't get fired because he's got enough of a track record. So trust takes a lot of time, and sometimes you're in a situation of uncertainty where actually you haven't got time there to build up the trust. But at least being honest about that, and therefore giving particular attention on, that relationship is key. And then finally, of course, communication. Are you talking in language? It's a real, to me, an obvious point. I built my career on it. Just putting yourself in someone else's shoes. I'm well aware that what I do, most people don't understand the heavy maths. And there's a whole lot of people who give heavy maths to people, they don't understand it, and therefore they come to me because I don't do that.
Both ways.
And it's such a basic point about what's their situation. I made this point to someone the other day, and they said it's a key part of negotiation. Just what does the other party want out of the situation? You're not trying to humiliate them. If you go and say to the CEO, this is really uncertain, it's really hard what to do, that's an awkward position to be in. So give him some advice, give him some an adaptability and resilience, deconstruction. So you can say there is a way out of this. This is a fuzzy situation, but we can give you some structure around it. So
there's two things I like about this cartoon. Number one, how the person on my left is worried about his drink, right? How's moving his drink into safety. And then probably we could go through the formula, but for that we would need a separate episode. Episode 250. We'll go through that. But the point is well taken.
I don't know who did the cartoon, so I apologise for any infringement on that. In full respect to the person who did it.
Well, that relativity theory is over 100 years old, so I assume any patent is gone, right?
So there you have it. And I think one of the things I would really say is, this came out of people then with very specific backgrounds in terms of how they worked in insurance. But I think we felt that these principles actually could apply everywhere. There might be certain principles which would be relied upon more, depending on what area you work in. And there is no formula for how you do these. They're just sort of effectively a list of top tips. And the paper gives sort of more detailed top tips about what to do under these. And there is probably scope for a lot more depth to be done on them. This has been around now for over 5 years. Well, I love this group. The group that did this, by the way, we had no idea we'd end up with this, which I thought was a good example of a good working party. This evolved 3 or 4 years in, and then finally got sort of finalised in 2018/19.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from maybe not from sort of the immediate actuarial environment, but maybe a bit from the outside?
I think people like them. I mean, no one's. One of the problems is you've got to remember what they are. We try to, we've given you 6 fairly memorable things. You could test the audience in a week's time. Can you remember them? But you do sort of have to use them. And I have spoken to people. One of the people I know is a partner in a big consultancy firm. She was one of the co-chairs, and she says she still finds these useful, in situations, just to sort of it's that slow thinking. It's a more structured way of stepping through what is a really tricky situation. And we haven't found, they've survived to us the test of time. We've still not found, gosh, we should change the wording of any of these. Now, somebody in the audience here might do that, fine. But, that was one of the ideas of this was have some longevity to the whole piece of work. Now, we have a problem, I think, of awareness. They should have been using these through the pandemic. Unfortunately, no one cited them, but they won't go away. So my plea to the audience here is to, if you like these, please promote them, use them. They're not that hard to use. They
by all means,
that'd be great.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we definitely learned a lot today. And I said earlier on, I like that combination between the creating engagement, bringing people on board, keeping them on board, and then the more structured methodological part, which is described in between point 2 and point 5. So definitely we put all the links and the paper in the show notes. If anybody is interested in more detail, have a look at the paper, get in touch with either Paul and or myself. I'm sure he and the group would be very happy to have feedback and hear that hundreds and thousands of good use cases, right?
Yeah. Thank you for your interest, Reg. So thank you for the opportunity.
No, Paul, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for your time, and wish you a good summer, and see you around.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.